How do you decide on your occupation? If you're a student and you're starting out, how do you decide on your occupation? How do you decide whether to change your occupation? What do you do when you can't do your occupation anymore? Maybe you lost your job, or you've retired, or you got an injury, and so you can't quite do it in the same way. What do you do if your occupation is difficult, stressful, maybe draining you of energy? What do you do if you feel like your occupation is not providing you with the kind of joy or purpose or meaning that you hoped it would? These are some of the questions we've been trying to address in some way over the last several weeks through our series called Work Isn't a Four-Letter Word. That no matter what kind of work you do, whether you're a student or you're employed or part-time or full-time, whether you're working at home with family or working with family and doing another job, whether you're working out of the office or whether you have a place where you go to work, shop floor, whatever kind of work that you do, how do you find more joy, more meaning, and even find God himself at your work? And I hope that if you've had a chance to catch any of these last messages or journey with us all the way through, that this has been helping you peel the layers on understanding your work a little bit more in the light of what God thinks about it and how you can think about it as well. But there's kind of one answer as it relates to all of our occupations that we haven't explored yet. And it's actually an answer that you might think, well, I don't really think this applies to me. And here's what I mean. 15 plus years ago, when I was leaving the corporate life to become a pastor, and I was starting to tell the people that I was working with at the time why I was leaving, what I was doing, I had the same somewhat odd conversation over and over and over again. All of these people that I worked with, they kept saying, when I told them that I was going to go be a pastor, they said, well, I guess that's a calling, isn't it? I guess that's a calling, isn't it? In other words, I guess what you're leaving is sort of this ordinary work, however you got into it, and one job led to another, but now you're being called to go do something else that's very different than this kind of work. And it's a calling is something for certain jobs or certain people. It's kind of what they were implying in some way. And it wasn't just them. When I actually went and did my interview with our denomination to see if they were going to decide to license me as a pastor in our denomination, one of the questions they asked me in the interview was, oh, can you describe your calling into being a pastor? Why do you think you're called to do this? It kept surfacing this idea that calling is for certain jobs and certain people, not all jobs and not all people. That there's a special kind of calling that comes for certain people to do certain things. And I think there's a big problem with that. and I actually want to get underneath that because this word calling is key to help us understand, how do I decide what occupation I would do? Or how do I decide whether I should change my occupation? Or what do I do when that occupation, when I can't do it anymore, or when it's stressful or draining, or maybe not providing me joy and purpose? It's actually, calling is key to unlocking some of the other aspects of work that we haven't touched yet. And it actually applies to every one of us. And here's why. Because if there is such a thing as calling, then there is a caller. God, the one who calls. And what you will find from the writers of Scripture and actually 2,000 years of church history is that this God calls everyone. Every man, every woman, every child, regardless of their age, regardless of their social status, regardless of the jobs that they will do, there is a calling that comes from God, the caller, to every person. Ben Patterson, in his book on work, said it this way, that there is, we're called to many different occupations, but we're called to one vocation. That we have many different occupations, but we are actually called to one vocation. There is one vocation that applies to every person, no matter what your occupation. In fact, we can say it this way, we have different jobs, but the same calling. Different jobs with the same calling. And I want to unpack, well, what that calling is. Now, if you're here and you're a follower of Jesus, this absolutely applies to you. This is the one calling, the one vocation that you have on your life, no matter what your occupation is. And in fact, that you can change your occupation all the way through your life, but your vocation will never change. And that vocation is going to inform how you carry out your occupation. And it is for everyone who follows Jesus that this is a calling that is on your life. Now, if you're here and you're not a follower of Jesus and you're exploring faith, hopefully by the end of this conversation, you'll be like, hey, I hope that everyone who is a follower of Jesus actually takes this vocation seriously as they do their occupation. You would actually want everyone who is following Jesus to do this, to understand what their one calling, their vocation is. But it actually may help you understand some of the missing pieces in your work as you are exploring what would it mean to make Jesus the center of my life? How would that affect and touch every part of my life, especially the work, the thing that I will do more than I will do anything else other than sleep, and sometimes even affects my sleep, that this is actually an integrating experience for you, as we say here at The Well, that your faith is about everyday life. Now, I want to get into what the answer to this question is. What is this one vocation? What is the one thing that we are called to do, that every person is called to do, that you have the same vocation if you're a follower of Jesus, though you may carry it out in different occupations? And I want to actually read for you a letter that was written. It's called a general letter in a sense. It's written to everyone. It wasn't written to a specific person. In fact, it was written, we think, historically to many different communities of Jesus followers all over kind of Central Asia and areas of Turkey in the first century, around a few years after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, explaining that in light of what Christ has done, what does this mean for how all of you live your lives? So these were letters, think about it, that were written, this one I think by the Apostle Peter, that would have been read out publicly on a Sunday gathering for all of the followers of Jesus to hear. And in this, he gets into what our one vocation is, no matter what our occupation is. And I'm reading in 1 Peter 2, verse 9. For you are a chosen people. You are royal priests, a holy nation, God's very own possession. As a result, you can show others the goodness of God, for he called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Now, there are two really important words here that have to do with our calling, our one vocation, but they're problematic words right from the jump. So we got to get into this and understand, what do these words even mean? One of them seems very irrelevant. The other one feels kind of negative in our culture. And yet they are key to understanding what your and my one vocation is, no matter what our occupation is. And I think first, the two words are priests, that you are priests, and because you are part of a holy nation. The word priest seems irrelevant to us. The word holy feels negative to us. And I'll explain in a few minutes why in our culture that feels like a negative word, but why we have to understand what it really actually meant. Now, one of the first things to understand is when he's saying, hey, your vocation is to be priests because you're part of a holy nation, we have to understand a little bit who Peter was writing to. First of all, he's writing to people, everyone in the church, who would have had many different occupations. They would have been soldiers, governors, blacksmiths, tradespeople, fishermen. Some of them would have been former prostitutes. We know, and some of the people that were being saved and coming into the community of Jesus, they would have come from many different backgrounds. And so they actually had very different occupations. None of them were priests, but he's saying to them, you're all priests. So first of all, it's like, okay, this doesn't have to do with occupation. There's something else going on here because they had many different occupations. He's addressing everyone in the room and he's saying, by the way, you're all priests. Okay, this is not about occupation. Secondly, he says, you're a holy nation, except that they weren't one nation. This is not about an ethnic identity or a specific group of people. In fact, I think this letter would have gone to several churches in this area that would have been made up of Jews, Romans, Greeks, Turks. The church by this point in history was multi-ethnic. It was all over the place. And so he's not talking about a national identity or an ethnic identity. And yet he's saying, in a sense, this is like a letter that's going to a group of individuals. Like he's saying, you're all priests, but also to a community. You are one nation. that not defined by ethnicity. So there's this multi-ethnic community. So there's both an individual kind of tone and direction to this letter and this instruction and this vocation, but also a communal one. So that he's talking to each person with different occupations, and he's talking to the community as a whole of something we embrace together. And so let's get into this first. This is the one vocation that you have if you're a Jesus follower, no matter what your occupation. What is it? Well, first it's the priest. And he says, you're royal priests. Now, some of them, or many of them would have come from maybe the Jewish faith background or different religions that would have probably had priests. And there's lots of different things that priests did, but just to simplify it for today, can I say it in the context of Jewish faith? The goal of the priest was the priest brought the people close to God, and they brought God close to the people. This was the job of a priest, to bring the people close to God and to bring God close to the people. Let me explain what I mean. One of the coolest things that the priests got to wear back in the day when they were first establishing the priesthood in Israel was there was a vest that the high priest would wear. And on the vest were 12 different gemstones. Like this was the original bling. Okay, this was very expensive. 12 different gemstones. And the number 12 was not accidental. Each gem or each stone represented a tribe of Israel. There were 12 tribes. So think about this. The priest is going into the presence of God, carrying on his chest or on his heart or carrying with him all of the people, right? The 12 tribes represented every person. So the priest is bringing the people to God. And in a sense, what he was doing when he was there, he was asking asking God for forgiveness for them. He was asking God for provision and healing for them. He was bringing their needs. In a sense, he was reminding God, see these people, remember them, care for them, bless them, protect them, forgive them. I, the priest, am bringing them to you. That was what the priest did. He went to meet with God on behalf of the people. He was representing, or in a sense, bringing the whole nation or all the people with him into the presence of God. That was part of what the priest did, was to bring the people to God on their behalf. See them, bless them, care for them, forgive them, know them, don't forget them, God. I'm bringing them to you. But then the priest would also bring God close to the people. He would return to the people with words from God so that when the priest spoke, he was speaking the words of God. Or when the people spent time with the priest and when the priest was close to them, they were like, oh, this is like being close to God because this person was close to God. So now I'm close to them, which means I'm close to God. He was bringing God close to the people. He was bringing God's blessing. Sometimes he would come and speak God's words of encouragement or God's words of correction or God's words of wisdom or God's words of blessing. And as the priest blessed the people, it was like God was blessing the people. So this is what the priests were doing. They brought the people to God and they brought God to the people. But the priests were a very select group. In fact, you had to be born into the priesthood. There was the chief priests, or people who they had to come from their parents. Their dad had to be a priest, and they would have been raised by priests to know all the duties and all the words in the scripture and the sacrifices and how it all works, and be taught the great lineage of all of the people who had been priests. And if you were the high priest, that was there were a priest and then chief priest and then the high priest, the number, kind of the head of all the priests. You had to have come from the very original first high priest, which was Aaron. Aaron was actually the brother of Moses, and Aaron was the first high priest. And he was the one that ultimately, above all, represented the people to God and brought God to the people. And unless you had come from the line of Aaron, you could not be the high priest. And in fact, the high priest would go into this place called the Holy of Holies, this place where they thought God's presence was, like the singular, like kind of the closest place to God. Only the high priest could go once a year. And so this was a very select group. You had to be born into it. Except that for the Jesus followers in the new community, Jesus had now become the high priest. Even though Jesus wasn't born in the priestly lineage, in fact, his dad was a carpenter. He did not come from the lineage of Aaron, which is why all the religious people and the chief priests, and in fact, the high priest at the time, there were high priests going, how could you're not a religious person. Like, you have no pedigree. You haven't been born into this. And yet he was teaching them and he was telling them what was right and wrong. He was telling them what was wrong with the way they were carrying out their jobs as priests, which is why they killed him. Right? That's part of the story. But Jesus, now the new community of Jesus followers, has started calling him, Jesus, the new high priest. And then Peter says, and by the way, now you're all priests. That's what he said. Which, as they're listening to this, would have been like, oh, wait, we're supposed to quit our occupations? None of us are supposed to be soldiers or blacksmiths or merchants or retailers or fishermen or whatever anymore. It's like, no. Like, that's your occupation, but your vocation now is all the same. Jesus, the high priest, and now you are all priests. You are going to, in a sense, bring the people that are around you to God, to bring them close to God, to represent, to carry the people around you on your chest, on your heart, to bring them to God and to bring God close to the people around you. This is what you're supposed to do. You bring people to God, you bring and invite God as you pray and as you appeal for God to forgive them and notice them and see them and care for them, the people that are close to you. And then you, as a result of being in the presence of God, when you go spend time with people, as you speak, as you bless, as you forgive, you are like the words and the power of God to them. It was an incredible thing for Peter to say to the everyday people in their everyday jobs, in their everyday occupations. You now have a new vocation. You are all priests. It was stunning. That was the new vocation. And how are you going to do that? He says, as a holy nation. Now, this is a problem because in our culture, and to some degree, even back then, I don't know, the word holy kind of has negative connotations. Like in our culture, in our day, we think holy means like, if you say, oh, someone's so holy, don't be like, oh, thank you. It's like probably they're dissing you. They're probably saying, you're so self-righteous, right? We even have we used to have this saying called holier than thou. Oh, you're holier than thou. I'm so much better than you. Holy kind of means self-righteous. Like that you would look down on other people that aren't as righteous as you or aren't as religious as you or don't know the things that you know about God or don't live as morally upstanding a life. That holiness kind of breeds this self-righteousness. That's what it's almost synonymous with now in our culture. Perhaps that was your experience with people who were really holy, as they made you feel unholy or other people like that. But the word holy also can mean unrelatable. In other words, not disconnected from everyday life. It's not a word we use unless we're swearing. That holy means kind of disconnected, irrelevant to everyday life. But also distant. If God is holy, sort of up there, away, far away, not just not connected to everyday, but far removed, way distant, spiritual as opposed to unspiritual or ordinary. And even some of that was coming out in the way my friends that I was quitting the job was saying, oh, that what you're doing now, that's like a calling, right? Like that's like holy work, unlike what we were doing here in marketing or business or something. And then maybe the worst, like segregated. In other words, not integrated, but segregated, not with the common people. In a sense, holy people are sort of untouchable. Ooh, everyday ordinary people couldn't get close to them. They'd be too dirty or something like that. And the fact is, many priests, especially in the day of Jesus, were like that. They looked down on others. They exuded a kind of righteousness that made others feel guilt and shame. There was an irrelevance. The stuff that they did, the law they did, most of the people didn't even follow the laws anymore because they're like, I can't do this. This just doesn't work in my everyday life, right? It's too disconnected. It's unrelatable. And in fact, some of them had this kind of removed. They were in the temple mostly and not out in everyday life. So they were disconnected. They were distant. And of course, there were people that were untouchable, people that priests, if you were really holy, well, you wouldn't eat with certain people and you wouldn't talk with certain people and you would never even be seen with certain people. You wouldn't use the same dishes that someone else, but you wouldn't be in certain neighborhoods. Even you never go into a home of this kind of person or that person. So there was a segregation that the priesthood had come to be known by. That's what holy meant until the Holy One became human, right? This is the beauty of Jesus when they began calling Jesus the great high priest. And then you look at his life and you're saying, what was the holiness of Jesus like? Well, he was so good and yet not self-righteous. Truly good and not self-righteous. You know how you know? Is because people who were far less good than him wanted to be around him and felt comfortable in his presence, right? People who had no kind of moral kind of standing like he did approached him and were pretty sure that he would receive them well. that he was truly good, but not self-righteous. He didn't make other people feel bad and ashamed in his presence. He made them want to feel they wanted to be like him. They wanted to be good. This was true righteousness, not self-righteousness. He was so relatable. I mean, we talked a couple of weeks ago about most of his life's work was in the trades. He was a carpenter, or perhaps something. He may have been a stonemason or something like that, but he did manual labor work for most of his life. He knew life and everyday life. And in fact, they said, even when he began to teach like a rabbi, they said, how's this possible that the common people understand him? He speaks with such power and authority, but the everyday person understands him. Not like these other religious leaders they had. That's what they said. He's so relatable. He's so everyday. We can even understand him. He was so close to people, right? He was not distant up there in his holiness. In fact, when you read the biographies of Jesus, you will find this constantly. He's surrounded and crushed by crowds. There were always people around him. He was so close to people, and he was the opposite of segregated. He was so integrated in their lives. Jesus ate with whoever would welcome him. He did not say, oh, you're too dirty, you're untouchable. In fact, he touched the untouchables like lepers. And instead of worrying about whether he would be contaminated by them, they were healed and made clean by him. He spent time with people that other people said, oh, you're too dirty, or you've made a mess of your lives, or I would never go into that person. He was constantly inviting himself into people's homes. Don't see this as Jesus as the rude kind of traveler. See this as saying, hey, people thought, oh, you would never want to be in my home. And he says, oh, I'm coming to your house today, or let's eat with you, or why don't you throw a party and I will come. He was so integrated that he was where they were. This is what the holiness of Jesus looks like. And now we are given vocation to be priests like him. To carry out our job as priests, as a holy nation, and that word holy really means unique, set apart, unlike any others, but not segregated, not self-righteous, not distant, not disconnected and irrelevant, but a unique group of people that no matter what your occupation, what makes us holy is that no matter what occupation we have, we see this vocation as ours. We are unique in the sense that we are meant to bring people to God and then bring God to the people. This is our one vocation that we carry on our hearts and on our minds every time we meet with God in prayer. And we're like saying, God, notice them, bless them, care for them, forgive them. God, we're bringing the everyday people that we interact with in our jobs, in our schools, in our workplaces, in our neighborhoods, in our families, because that's where we are in everyday life with everyday people. We bring them to God. And then we, as a result of spending time with God, bring God to them so that when they are spending time with us, it feels like to them, even if they can't put their finger on it, that they are in the presence of God. Not because we're so holy and self-righteous, but because they feel the power and the love and they hear the blessing and forgiveness of God coming out of our mouths as if God was speaking forgiveness, grace, blessing, mercy, wisdom to them. That is our one vocation. And here's the thing. This isn't about like preaching about Jesus in your school or in your workplace. I mean, some people may be interested to know about your faith, but you may find yourself in a job or a place where I can't do that here. Or perhaps you may say, nobody in my school or in my workplace is ever asking me questions about my faith. They're not interested in it. Fine. How do I be a priest? Because you're taking them, their names, their roles, your community, to the presence of God. You're wearing them like Aaron's tripped out vest with all the stones. Like these are the names of God, the names of people that I work with that I'm bringing into the presence of God in prayer. And then as a result, as I spend time with God, I come and I bring the presence of God to them. And my presence of forgiveness and grace and blessing and wisdom is as if God was right there with them. And in verse 9, he actually says, this is what it looks like. It isn't about preaching and telling everyone this is what, it isn't about saying, well, I don't do this and we're going to do that because I'm a Christian or because I'm a holy priest, I don't do that. He says it in verse 9. Why you're a holy priest or you're priests of a holy nation so that you can show others, verse 9, the goodness of God. Isn't that beautiful? You can show others the goodness of God because they need to know it, because you have experienced it. As you experience the goodness of God and you bring people their names in prayer, and you're spending time in the presence. That's what the priest did. The priest spent time in the presence of God and then went and spent time with the people. That's what they were supposed to do. In fact, sometimes you'd find it where they were in the presence of God and it was so powerful that their faces would shine and glow, and then they would come out and that glow would still be with them as they were with the people. That's like a visual metaphor of what's meant to happen for every priest, for every one of us, as we spend time with God and we experience His goodness, His love, His wisdom, His grace, His forgiveness for us as we are in His presence. We know who He really is and what He's really like. Then as we go into our schools and our workplaces, man, we're bringing that knowledge and experience of the goodness of God. Peter says, you can show others the goodness of God because that's what a priest does. Which means this, the more that you experience God's goodness firsthand, like firsthand experience His goodness, the more you have that in you as you go into the places where you work. You get that? You experience, you taste the goodness of God, and you have that in you to give as you go into the places where you do your work. Which is just to say this, right? It means that every day is take Jesus to work day, right? Every day is take Jesus to work day. And if it's true that every day is take Jesus to work day, then you need to spend time with Jesus every day. That's how that works. Every day is take Jesus to work day. There isn't any workplace where He won't go. You don't check Him at the door. He's not stuck here in the church or in your Bible somehow that He's only out when you let Him out like a genie in a bottle or something like that. He goes everywhere you go. There is no place He's like, oh, this is boring or this is a waste or this place is cursed, I'm not going. He goes with you. Every day is take Jesus to work day. And if it is, then spend time with Jesus every day. I want to, rather than just kind of give you 7 steps to do that, I thought, you know how they say like when you read about Olympic athletes or professional athletes or whatever, when they talk about kind of being able to do what they do best in the moment, they talk about visualizing it ahead of time. They said there's power in thinking through, what is this going to be like as I get to this place? What if we use our imagination, ask God to guide that as we think about our workplace? What does it mean to take Jesus to work every day? What does it mean to be priests who bring the people close to God and bring God close to the people? And so if this doesn't trip you out too much or whatever, would invite you to just close your eyes and follow along with me as I lead you through a little bit of visualization exercise about your work, about taking Jesus to work. So you can just close your eyes and kind of, if it helps you, just kind of open your hands on your lap, just as a posture of sort of openness and trusting God to lead you in this moment. You can kind of slow down your breathing. I invite you first just to picture the beginning of your day, like where you wake up every day. And don't jump out of bed yet. Just picture yourself just slowly waking up. And in fact, picture Jesus kind of gently waking you up. Not your rude alarm. Just gently waking you up saying, hey, you're taking me to work today. See the delight on His face. He's excited about the day. Now, before you start your day, picture yourself spending time with Him. Maybe you're just lying in bed and you're praying. Maybe the beginning of the day is when you read your Bible, or you just take a few minutes in silence. Picture yourself there with Him. Even now, as you're doing that, say a short prayer under your breath for the names of the people that you work with. Maybe your classmates, your boss, your team, maybe your kids, people you do work for, ones you teach, parent. Remember, you're like carrying their names on your chest. You know, you're bringing them to God. So take a moment and just pray for those people. Now picture your travel time to work. Maybe it's the bus you take, or you get a ride from one of your parents, or you drive into work, or maybe you just slide your chair across the floor in your home office. Just picture that. Remember, Jesus is going with you. Where is he sitting? Picture where he's sitting. Picture what's the expression on his face. And now, in your mind's eye, see your classroom that you're walking into, or your office, or the clinic, or shop, or place where you work, or even the Microsoft Teams group you're logging into, the meeting you're starting. He's walking in with you. Remember, you're taking him to work. He didn't drop you off at the door and leave. He's walking in with you. Just picture that. He's sitting right beside you at your desk. Now hear him say to you, I want to bless this place and these people. I want to bless this place and these people. Now, under your breath, you just pray this prayer to him. Lord, who needs to know your goodness this week? Wait for him to name someone or show you a face or a group of people. Lord, who at my school or work needs to know your goodness this week? And then finally, ask him to wake you up every day and remind you that he's going to work with you today.